Welcome to Embedded Finance Review Podcast. My name is Lars Markl. In this episode, we're going to speak about cars, or in-car payments to be specific. The world of financial services is blending more and more into different part of our day, and especially in the last year, we've seen a number of car brands announce new payment-related products or features. I guess we all understand how car-related payments, such as parking or paying at toll booths, can be improved. But how does it actually work, and who is doing what? In this episode, I'm speaking with Mark Gerban, who's a payment veteran. Currently, he's head of product at Pairpoint, an IoT software provider, but before he worked at Mercedes-Benz and Apple. He has actively built in-car payment products and shares his insight in this episode. Let's dive in. Hi, Mark. Welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today, and in what part of the world are you actually located right now?
Hi, Lars. Thanks for having me. So currently right now I'm in Hamburg, Germany, and just kind of enjoying the nice sunny day that we're actually having here. It's amazing.
Great. I think actually Hamburg was also the place we met for the first time a couple of years ago. I just interviewed a couple of weeks ago Nick from Casco, and it was exactly the same story when he said, yeah, I'm in Hamburg right now. That's where I remembered. That's actually the first time we met, I think, and maybe we also met 2015, 16, around these days.
Yeah, I think so. It was probably around the Sternstraße area it was quite well back then.
Exactly. Today, we are going to do a little bit of a deep dive on the topic of car payments, to be specific. We spoke briefly about them in the pre-chat already. With my newsletter, I obviously cover everything in and around embedded finance. And again, definition of embedded finance is non-financial brands doing something in the world of financial services. What I've noticed in the last 12 months is that more and more car brands are doing something in payments and have launched something in payments. Obviously, we're going to talk about that. There are a couple of car brands who have been doing that for a very long time, and they not just started this year, but I did notice that even smaller car brands, not just the big fancy brands, so to say, have launched something. So my goal with this episode is a little bit okay, let's set a little bit the stuff straight. What's happening in the industry? What are the car brands exactly doing? And obviously you with your background are a perfect person to answer all these questions.
Thanks. I guess it's a compliment.
Maybe to kick things off, mention now in-car payments, and I guess we can all understand a little bit. There are car-related costs, maybe let's say parking or paying for a toll booth, and obviously this can be somehow done as an in-car payment. But maybe can you help us to give a little bit of an introduction? What do we really mean when somebody says in-car payment?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and I think it's also something the whole industry is still struggling to understand. So what we're kind of looking at is that anything that takes place in car as an actual transaction while you're driving per se, or not in motion, because there's also these regulatory aspects of what you can and can't do based on today's technologies and constraints. That's what we're talking about with in-car kind of commerce, if you will. So we'll see stuff and you really have to think about stuff that's very obvious to cars. So we're looking at fueling, charging, parking, tolling, QSR. So we're talking about, restaurants and being able to do drive-through, that kind of thing. These are kind of obvious things that should be taking place in a vehicle, because they are. It's just that we do them in a slightly different way today. And just that those experiences today are moving from this ecosystem of here are parking terminals, or here are this or that. And now we're converging that kind of infrastructure into the actual vehicle itself. And that has a lot more of a better digital experience and gives people a bit more control into having a better customer journey.
Okay. And maybe a little bit on the historical, looking at the timeline so far from your perspective, or maybe you can also touch a little bit on your personal background. When was the first time you heard about in-car payments? Is this a trend which has been going on for quite a long time, or is it something rather recent?
Well, it's been attempted for years. It's just a question of really where it started to pick up. The first time I started really seeing any more serious push towards this direction was with my previous employer when I was at Mercedes. And by the way, everything I say here is my own personal opinion and not that of Mercedes. So for the audience to understand. But when I was actually over at Apple, I remember Mercedes purchased a company and more or less was going to call it Mercedes Pay. And that's where I recognized, okay, here's another wallet. The industry is trying to do a copy and paste into automotive. And that was the first time I remembered seeing that there was some sort of movement in that direction. I think it was around 2015, 2016, maybe a little bit afterwards. So it's been almost, let's say, close to a decade at least that the industry has been trying to move in this direction. Though they thought of the idea of, okay, here's payments, but they didn't really know how to apply it and how to use it.
Hmm.
And that's where this whole entire maturity process has kind of come into place. And there's a lot of different dynamics within payments where the automotives are not really built in a way that scalability is going to play in their favor. Because when you compare the smartphone industry, which has literally billions of devices, versus just a few million devices per year, it's a much harder ecosystem to bring in content.
So would you say now, you said like the industry is attempting or is doing something for a bit over 10 years. Are we still like in a niche phase? Do you see certain like science and development that is could be like or has picked up already or might be picking up in the near future?
Well, let's say this, like traditionally OEMs were involved in some way, sense or form for decades now
Hmm.
in financing. So when you
Hmm.
think about when you finance a vehicle, there's actually that experience that's been there. It was actually pretty amazing to me that very often this is completely overlooked. So
Hmm.
it's something where, when you're talking about car financing plans and payment plans and all this stuff, the knowledge for a lot of them, some of them brought that in-house with their own financing arms, their own banks, but they usually have no connection with the vehicles.
Hmm.
Now, that's something which I thought was kind of strange because there's a bit of a misalignment and there could be some big advantages for those companies, but they just haven't taken advantage of them. So I would say if I would compare, payments, there has been a form of payments that's been around for a very long time, like
Hmm.
maybe even precursor to obvious internet transactions. Moving that over to the evolution we've seen today, where you're taking a look at payments within vehicles and within that kind of direction, that's gradually now moving forward, though it's taking a lot of time to get the user experience right.
Hmm.
Also, because the regulation that exists today, for example, if we talk about like 3D Secure or something like this, when you're driving, you're presented a 3D Secure challenge, or you kind of think about that and you're training the person to pick up their phone, which is usually where they do their commerce.
Hmm.
And that kind of defeats the whole purpose of doing the in-vehicle payment. So there have been authentication mechanisms like delegated authentication, that kind of stuff, which have been used to basically mitigate challenges, but they're not completely gone and it's not completely scalable.
Understood. And Mark, you said the customer, the user experience, and you touched on a couple of points that can happen. It. Can we perhaps like do like one practical walkthrough, like how could an in-car payment exactly look for, let's say, I've never owned a car, never bought a car, but let's say I'm buying my first car now. Maybe specifically to get into to use in-car payments. Like how would my user journey look like when I say, okay, now I have this new car, my car manufacturer offers me an in-car payment method. Is there a standard way of how to using it, how to leveraging it?
Yeah, I'll go back to one of my former colleagues who said that the vehicle, in the perfect scenario, should give a gift of time.
Hmm.
And what payments should do in a vehicle is give you not just convenience, but give you time. So perfect example is, let's say you're driving and you're looking for parking. Well, parking in the way it's presented today, some OEMs do it where they actually actively expect you to open up an app, either
Hmm.
via your phone or via the head unit. Sometimes if you're unlucky, you have to register, which is actually most of the time.
Hmm.
And then you're supposed to then actively search and go through the locations, entering your payment details, all this stuff. And that's a horrible experience. So where it needs to go, and some companies have started to do this, is you're using geofencing tech when you're looking for a parking spot. Your vehicle knows the location, the area is gridded, so you know your pricing, all these other details. You then have your payment details, which have been collected previously from the OEM, usually
Hmm.
within their app, and those are seamlessly already available so that at the time you reach that parking spot, you simply just say, at the time the vehicle may ask you, which could be either via voice or via touching, or you can optionally even have it so it's automatically done that the payment just occurs.
Hmm.
So it depends really. Most consumers would say, well, I want to confirm that I'm in a parking spot
Yeah.
before that typical checkout experience you have online that you want to have 3 steps usually. It's like when you're in a vehicle, you are going to a parking spot. That's step one. You turn off your vehicle. That's step two. Your vehicle actually detects that you're there. And step three is, do you want to pay? And that's just by a general human nature of what the behavior is today.
Of course. And would you say then, like maybe specifically in Europe, when we talk about in-car payments, most of the time it's then done on card rails at the end of it? Is that the usual way of then eventually paying for it?
When we're looking at companies that focus mostly on cards at the very beginning, it usually shows that they don't understand payments, at least in the ecosystem, because there's so many different payment methods.
Mm-hmm.
There's so many different ways to actually pay, though you have to look at first payment methods that can be used continuously or also on a recurring basis, which then limits some
Mm-hmm.
methods that are on the market. Then you're also looking at payment methods which need to have higher basket sizes.
Mm-hmm.
So right now we're talking about basket sizes of maybe up to $150. If you're in fleet scenarios, that kind of thing, that's where things get really expensive because
Mm-hmm.
you're talking about, trucking where they'll pay $2,000 for, $1,500 to $2,000 for, fueling their truck. In the future, what we're probably going to see as well is OEMs are going to get smarter on production. And production right now today, what you have is an assembly line,
Mm-hmm.
where an assembly line produces customized cars. So you have basically for every single car that you have to change something, do it that kind of way. That means that the speed of production today in that regard is good compared to if you're doing it just on a one-on-one basis, but over a production line, that's actually pretty slow.
Mm-hmm.
So the way you speed that up is you build just one type of car with all the bells and whistles. At some point, when you have the money to pay for it, you pay a lot of money. Let's just use heated seats or higher engine power or whatever it might be. And you activate that. So it's like a pay on demand kind of service. Mm-hmm. And when you have that, that's actually where payments in itself will have much higher basket values. So you
Mm-hmm.
can have, I don't know, think of money laundering issues that'll be coming into play here in KYC. You will have a much more streamlined operation. So you're having a huge operative cost. So there's probably going to be, and I'm explaining an extreme scenario, but there's probably going to be a sweet spot where you'll have building just the right amount of stuff for that vehicle is where that's going to be a good investment because
Mm-hmm.
you know that you can activate and carry on those new users.
So I guess like I'm not a car guy, but I guess we all have, even those listeners who are also not car people, probably have read and then use one or two announcements of certain car manufacturers who started as a service model for heating and other things. And obviously, or not obviously, but they were in some cases a backlash of consumers who were like, okay, it's built in the car anyway. Why should I pay extra for it? But your argument in a way is, or what you're describing is, these things make a lot of sense for the car manufacturer because production can actually get a lot more efficient and that way cheaper. And monetization can then happen later. And again, then I guess the monetization part, activating these features is then something where specifically in-car payments can become extremely handy. And in a way, the in-car payment feature is then also something which can change the way the product is being used versus today.
Yeah, let's think of it this way. When you're dealing with different types of payment models, for example, what I completely disagree with outside of one scenario is when you have to pay a subscription fee per year for horsepower for a car you own. I think we actually saw this as BMW trying this out in the US probably about 2-3 years ago. And I think one or two other companies tried following this afterwards. I think for a person who's bought a vehicle, who owns that vehicle, having a subscription service for that is not a smart idea.
Mm-hmm.
Where it does make sense is if you're talking about leasing a vehicle.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, if I know I'm paying a monthly amount and I want to try a new feature and I'm paying a monthly amount for that, that actually fits that cohort or that idea that you already know you're paying something. So if you pay a little bit more for a feature, you can then say if you like it and keep it for that time or turn it off. And that fits that better than me buying, €150,000 vehicle. And then all of a sudden I can't use the extra horse. That would make me pretty angry as a consumer.
Yeah, and understandably. I just want to quickly come back to the example we spoke about before, the parking scenario where you described the different steps necessary. I guess I can also have my own opinion, like my own thoughts about it, but quite curious to hear it from you, like from a car manufacturer perspective. And obviously we mentioned you Guessing we're dealing with some of these problems also at Mercedes-Benz, but I don't want to look specifically at Mercedes-Benz, just rather at the industry as general. What is the biggest, the two biggest challenges for kind of car manufacturers actually to build like these really great products? Because in the way you're describing it, it sounds super convenient for me, right? I mean, I just go there, I stop my car, and in a way, maybe I confirm one more time, but at the end of it, it's insanely seamlessly. And whenever I rent a car, which I do occasionally, the experience is always not that great. So wondering what needs to happen. Is it something which has to strictly happen on the car manufacturer side where they have to build better products? And if that's the case, I'm quite curious to understand, is it more on the payment side or is it more on the non-payment side? Because what I would be expecting as well, there might be quite some integrations necessary with all these providers that needs to be paid. I'm quite curious to hear what you think about the industry is.
I'll be blunt on one of my answers because it more or less, I think, through certain experiences, and again, private opinion here.
Yeah.
So one of the biggest mistakes I've seen in the industry is for OEMs to try and be a wallet solution for other ecosystems.
Mm-hmm.
For example, if I talk about parking providers or QSRs or any scenario that you would have where you're talking about payment, OEMs are really good at building cars. They're really good at building hardware. They're really good at building certain types of experiences. But what they're not good at is becoming merchants and taking over merchant businesses. Because when you're also using these wallets in a lot of these ecosystems, they become either merchant of record or they have to learn how to manage payment risk, which they're really not good at doing. And when you're talking about the amount of work that the third parties that they have to work with have to do to accommodate a single OEM, it makes it very difficult to want to integrate. Imagine you're a parking provider, you have to integrate 40, 50 different OEMs, just as a base example, maybe for a certain region. And you have to do that in multiple sub-regions and stuff. That ends up being a mess. And that's just so much more work that it's actually not worth anyone's time, especially because the amount of volumes are extremely low.
Yeah.
I think Google and Apple with Android Automotive, or the gas system now that Google has put together, which is the second generation, and Apple with CarPlay, and then in the future they're going to have CarPlay 2, potentially are positioned if they can deliver better native experiences. So the experiences that they have right now are very boxy, not fitting into certain ecosystems, and they're now trying to get more flexible on this. The thing is, what they bring in that no OEM could match at all, and it's just, there's no question on it, is the total number of applications and developers that are there. So the developers actually want to develop in these ecosystems for free because they're so lucrative, right? Yeah. In the OEM spectrum, when I have a developer that would come, the OEM usually would pay for that. Like, or there has to be some sort of compromise where it's just not the same kind of business model because the economics don't function in the same way. So the reason I bring this story up is, one, I think that, this whole wallet direction is probably not the way to go. What probably is the way to go is you can still say that you have a wallet, you still have a capture mechanism, but you should probably look more as the vehicle being a method of which the payment information is passed to these parties. So that means that the OEM itself can capture this information, let's say card information or whatever other wallet information, from a specific app or the vehicle, and then they can actually pass it on via gateway sharing or via token sharing or even certificate sharing if you want to go down that path. That actually enables the third parties that are in those ecosystems to say, this is a lot easier for us to actually now do this business, because now we don't have to redo our entire payment systems, redo our entire business. We can do business as usual, and it's much easier just to scale. So that would be kind of piece one. The other piece is, I think OEMs will have the capability to have almost like an Apple or Google Pay type experience via storing payment credentials locally on the vehicle. And I think that they're starting to get to that idea that you can think about you have this huge device, if you will, right? You have a car. It has so many sensors around you. In fact, it's probably the world's ultimate risk engine because you literally can check everything. And in fact, it's probably so strong that you can say, arguably, that it's a better risk than you would have for a card present transaction. I would actually almost deem that as car present transaction, if you will, right? And so I'm actually thinking that what could happen is that OEMs will have more secure architecture that would be utilized in the future so that you can use this pass-through mechanism, which fits then network tokenization, which fits a lot of other stuff. And then OEMs through various means. So for example, if I have a charging cable, I have it plugged into the car, you can transmit a token that way. And you have probably, I'd say, since you have a vehicle that's connected to an object for a prolonged period of time versus a tap and go with a pin, also with all these other security mechanisms, I'm going to say that that's a very good risk that I want to take as a payment provider. So all of these things come together. And I think if they think about things a bit more in detail, you can look about saving money, having better risk, having better user experiences, and improving the ecosystem for the third parties that they need to work with.
Yeah. And from your perspective, or like obviously with your industry insights, and you spent quite a bit of time like thinking like very actively around these challenges and how to overcome it. Do you have a vision or like a concrete understanding how like the perfect in-car payment solution would look like? I mean, is it like quite clear for you, or do you think there's also still some learnings to be made to understand how people want to use it?
Yeah, one of the reasons I joined Pairpoint where I am right now is because they had a really interesting vision of utilizing SIMs on vehicles as a secure enclave. Now, for most people, they may not realize, but there are SIM cards embedded on practically every vehicle now, especially now that you need to have an over-the-air update. You need to have data to have that. So you usually use a SIM to tap into the network. Now, the SIM, because it's a hardware enclave, you can actually use that for multiple different scenarios, whether it be for trust, which is required for banking level kind of scenarios, and also for storing payment information. So, you could look at certificates, payment tokens, whatever you might think about. And by allowing OEMs to more or less tap into that whole entire usage of, we already have existing hardware and you have backwards compatibility, you're able to create payment experiences with vehicles at a much higher level of security, even scenarios where you don't have that connectivity because you have everything local. So if you have like, I think most people will also say if they've tried their internet enabled services in a vehicle, it's usually not running very well. Very choppy, very spotty. It will have to connect to your smartphone so you have a better connection kind of thing. Versus like if you have the vehicle just streaming it itself. So that part needs to be, I think, heavily improved. But while that part's a huge problem, if you have the payment details stored and I connect my charging cable to the vehicle, I'm utilizing the internet connectivity of another object, and therefore it's one less problem I have to worry about as an OEM to gain that connectivity.
Yeah, makes sense. And then from your perspective, do you see any car brands who are, I don't know, better positioned than other car manufacturers, car brands to actually be successful with in-car payments? I mean, you mentioned already, obviously, Apple and Google as two very important stakeholders in the whole game, getting more and more relevance inside the car. Obviously, there might be some car brands based on the type of customers or the price point they have who might be, I don't know, more likely. But is there like a general advisory from your side, like those car brands are more likely to succeed and they should definitely double down, and others who might be less likely to succeed?
Well, one of the players we didn't mention that definitely deserves some attention is Tesla, because they were the first to more or less bring in this plug and charge experience where you go to a Tesla charging station, you plug in your cables, and it just works. They use the vehicle, which sends an identifier to their back end, which then has payment information stored. So the customer already knows they're going to pay. Everything is already set there. And by plugging everything in, it just works. This is the reason why Tesla was so threatening for the market, is because they came up with experiences that were just miles ahead of everyone. Now, we're starting to see a lot of catch up with the Chinese OEMs. I think the Chinese OEMs have one major player that could completely disrupt everything we know about payments in China, and that would be Tencent with WeChat.
Mm-hmm.
The reason for that is that they already have a huge network. They have token capability. So most of, if you've used WeChat before, it's actually based upon using QR codes, which when you're driving is not the smartest thing. So you can still use a tokenization layer. Now, if you use a tokenization layer with all the other security bells and whistles that you would have with what the vehicle can offer, you would have very arguably a better security check than a QR code scan. So using those scans or using that ecosystem, it's interconnected with literally millions, hundreds of millions of merchants.
Mm-hmm.
And big, small, depends on the kind of experiences, but let's say for OEMs, let's water it down to a few thousand for fun. You still have access to so many different ecosystems that way that they can more seamlessly integrate and work with each other in China.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I would see some really interesting experiences coming from China, because now you have, with WeChat, you have a merging of content plus payments, right? When we're taking a look at Europe, we're seeing a lot of the German car companies now are laying off a lot of people. So they're trying to do a lot of cost savings, that kind of stuff. They could use payments as part of their strategy if they look at things a little bit smarter and start to digitize a bit more, because payments can take over a lot of operative pieces. So that's something where I think there's a pretty big improvement there. The struggle that's going to be is that there's a bit of a disconnect between the payment systems and the content. The only parties that actually have that done pretty well is, again, Google and Apple, because they brought in all of the content, which is super necessary.
Mm-hmm.
If you go outside of those ecosystems, you have very little flexibility with regards to the payment systems being tied to the other content providers. And that causes a scalability problem.
Mm-hmm.
So you have a very scalable solution, from my opinion, in Asia. You have a disconnected solution that you would have more or less in Europe, and you have that same applying in the US for these three major markets, right?
And then maybe you mentioned Pairpoint already. I want to touch on that as well, but maybe kind of closing off the previous flow of questions around the in-car payments is obviously for me, again, not so much into the development involved, but I remember reading about the developments around in-car payments and also attending conferences and hearing presentations and panel discussions. It was sometimes a little bit of the, let's say, dispute or a complaint from the one side saying what is really in-car payments? I mean, you said this nice term already, what was a card on file, so to say, car on file. In a way, isn't anything that happens around in-car related in-car related payments already something which basically can be done with a card on file data and then basically gone through that route? Do we really need some, let's say, specific activities around in-car payment? I'm not sure if this is a general dispute in the industry. At least that's what I've noticed at one point back in the days. Quite curious to hear your view on that.
I think if you talk to someone who's in e-commerce, you'd have that opinion, very rightfully so. However, when you get into the OEM world and you take a look at how things are actually interacting and functioning, there's a huge difference. And I like to use the term car present again, because a car present is a different kind of risk than you would have as a card or an e-commerce transaction. As everyone would rightfully state today, you would look at interchange. In Europe, it's capped. But one of the fees that you would have a really big, difficult time in reducing are your network fees, like when you're talking about Visa and MasterCard and so on. Now, those fees are affected based on the transaction type you have. So if you have an e-commerce transaction, it's naturally going to be higher with those fees than you would have with a card present transaction. My direction and thinking in payments here, and this is very payment specific, is that because a vehicle is a completely different kind of risk, and in many cases, probably a lot safer, because think about all the processes. One, usually a person to own a vehicle has to go through a large or very big KYC process. Even when you're buying a used vehicle, you have to go through a KYC process. Two, you have a car key, actually a physical fob, which you use if you're thinking about a PCI compliant building, you need to have a physical fob to get into, just on that piece alone. Three, you have all the sensors in the vehicle. So you have sensors that are there, you have active location, you can even do biometrics, and you have secure element. I would put more money into saying that ecosystem would be more secure than if I just used a card. So from a pure payments perspective, I would then say, if you're looking at transactions and we're speaking purely on transactions, my risk is a lower risk, and therefore it's classified as something completely different. And therefore it should be set up as something to meet that level of security.
Okay. So basically if I kind of like summarize it, is the reduced cost that potentially are around like the payments with car present was the right term you said, basically would obviously reduce the cost and perhaps even through that also enable completely different business cases and use cases as well.
Yeah. And better user experiences, just because if you're able to get experiences that are also embedded into the vehicle. So for example, if I talked about using mobile payment, let's say we go way down the line, and I don't think that many players are set up for this yet because of the transaction sizes and stuff. You're looking at, in some cases for gaming, they used to have it that you would send over a PIN and you'd have to enter in that PIN. That payment method would not work very well in a vehicle unless you change the dynamics of the vehicle and you say, well, let all the authorizations take place via the sensors, much like you have with iPhone. If you take a look, you have a default payment method of mobile payments on Apple devices. It's the same kind of mechanism to apply to a vehicle. And so that actually makes the payment method a better payment method and more suited for that ecosystem than if you would have an e-commerce scenario.
Mark, I guess we have all now listened to your answer the last half an hour or so, obviously understood your like really knowledgeable, insightful views on the topic, plus like spent quite a bit of time in the space. Now we mentioned already, we said a couple of times, your former employer, Mercedes-Benz, so you don't work actually for a car manufacturer anymore. And
Right.
now you work with a company, Pairpoint, which is not a car manufacturer. If you're so passionate about in-car payments, then how come you switched from a car manufacturer trying to achieve something like this to a completely different company? Maybe you can spot some light around that and maybe close a loop there.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the car manufacturer that I previously worked for, Mercedes, and again, everything is my own private opinion. I always love to say that just to keep myself in check. Basically, we did do a lot of very interesting stuff there. I was very happy about the work that I've done. There's stuff that's public where the teams worked on fingerprint payments, which is basically using delegated authentication frameworks. It's all public information. And there were other experiences where services were embedded directly into navigation. So there was a big push, at least from my perspective. It makes a lot of sense that you have things presented to consumers in a navigation display. The general reasoning is, and I want to be very general about this, so it goes for all OEMs, that most experiences, most commerce aspects are presented in an app-based scenario. They're packaged and put into an app. If you think about that logically, then you have to encourage your consumer to first go into an app, which is like going into their phone and then doing registration, all this other stuff. That experience just doesn't work. It's a very poor experience. So presenting stuff to consumers was also, it was obvious that you would present them in a navigation ecosystem, because when you're in a car, I'd say a lot of OEMs also can probably check out their data and say that a large majority of the time they're presenting their navigation screen, and the navigation screen is the perfect place to place services. Obvious. You drive around, you see, oh, there's a parking spot. I'm going to pay for it. You want to pay for it directly in that interface. Oh, there's a restaurant. Oh, there's a toll. All this other stuff. It's just obvious. Couldn't be any more obvious than that point. So I bring that all up because when I started presenting some of these findings in general, and again, not Mercedes specific, but like just in general, I found a lot of other OEMs didn't get that idea. And when I saw what Pairpoint was doing, I saw a vision of understanding of bringing kind of better user experiences that were tied also with payments in that kind of ecosystem. So that's kind of what drew me to the company. And even more so because, it's a Vodafone subsidiary. They have a partnership, and one of the investors as well is a group called Sumitomo, which is one of the largest Japanese conglomerates in the world. When I found out who they were, I was like, wow, these guys are huge. These are SoftBank huge, like very, very big.
Yeah.
So completely different kind of par. And the company has been around for 400 years. So I don't know too many companies that could say that, right?
Yeah.
The reason I was drawn to this is because to make a change like this in the industry, you can't do it with a single OEM. I think you need to really look at it from doing it from the entire ecosystem. And to do that, you need to be this needs to be an ecosystem play. And two, you need to have the resources and company backing that can actually handle that kind of change.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what brought me into saying, okay, this is the group that can do this. They have the technology, the know-how, all this stuff. And now we need to scale it and bring it out to the world. And you need big bucks for that.
But is Pairpoint then exclusively focusing on in-car related payment topics? Or, I mean, as I see in the website, I guess there would be a lot of other potential areas as well. So is it fair to say like in-car is one of the areas that could be potentially targeted?
Yeah, exactly. Actually, what I like about it as well is it allows me to expand into other areas.
Yeah.
So I have some colleagues that work specifically in shipping and logistics, like cargo ships and stuff like that. There are other areas as well with drones and other really cool kind of stuff. And I have to say I'm a bit of a techie nerd, if you will. So I like to kind of get my hands dirty in all different kinds of things just to have a better understanding of the world. And to have a technology that's really that wide and that useful keeps me busy, to be fair, and also allows me to be more creative. So it's always, every once in a while, I'll come up with something that we really could apply, and, we patent these kind of things. And that kind of stuff is really interesting to say, great, here's another great application of this technology, and this will belong to this company, and I'm a part of this growth.
Yeah.
Can't beat it.
Happy to hear that Mark has not left the in-car payment space. Obviously, he left to become manufacturer side, but in a way expects that companies like Pairpoint who try to solve this problem from a different angle might have even a higher chance of achieving that. Thank you so much for sharing all your wisdom and insights. Again, I think I said it before, the benefit of being a podcast host, you can ask the questions because you think your audience is interested, but in a way, there's also a lot of insights from me, a lot of questions from my side that have helped me to understand the whole space better. So thanks for sharing for that. If there's any listener out there who maybe wants to pick you up for a specific discussion, or maybe even wants to learn a little bit more what you're doing at Pairpoint, what's a good way to reach out to you?
Usually via LinkedIn, or I guess through the company website. I think we have some stuff to submit there. But to be honest, it's like, I'm a pretty open guy. So I always like to hear about people's thoughts and perspectives. So, doors wide open always.
So go out there, find Mark on LinkedIn. And again, thanks for sharing your insights. And maybe we have you on another show in a couple of years to see what progress we have made in the industry.
I look forward to it. Thank you for having me. Yeah.
Thanks, Mark. Until next time. Thank you for listening. For more episodes and our weekly newsletter, please visit embeddedfinancereview.com. And please reach out if you have an interesting embedded finance story to tell. Until next time.